examining internal factors, external connections, and personal identities. So, Sam, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. As you just heard Dr. Lynn say, my name is Sam Vasich, and I'm really excited to share what I've been working on this entire year with all of you. So before I get started, I wanted to give everyone the chance to look at my slides if they'd like to see them, because there's going to be a couple things that might be a little hard to read from the back, so if you want to zoom in or anything, now's a good time for it. I'll also post them at the end if you want them, if any of this impacted you in any way. That being said, before we dive into all of the things I did, I'd like to ask all of you to take a minute and just think about these two questions. The first one being, what do you find personally meaningful? And the second one being, how might students benefit from finding meaning? So just take a moment. Think of yourselves. So I hope you feel a little bit more grounded into what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, why did I bother doing any of this in the first place? And it comes back to being a peer mentor, actually. So I've had the pleasure of serving as a peer mentor for these past 3 years, and so I've had a really strong connection to the first year experience after going through it myself and realizing that, hey, I'd like to support people in ways I wish I could have been supported. But specifically with major declaration, I came into college knowing very well that I wanted to study psychology. And so I wanted to understand and gain a more person-centered understanding of what else goes into that and how can we understand it for all first-year students. So what I noticed as I began to read more about major declaration confidence is that there were two issues I picked out in the literature I was coming across. The first was context, in which a lot of literature examines specific majors such as STEM programs or pre-professional such as pre-law, pre-nursing programs. And secondly, a lot of articles focused on statistics that reflect well on the institutions, such as persistence to graduation, but don't necessarily account for the actual experience of the students. The second issue I noticed is that there's a bit of a lack of nuance in a lot of these articles, specifically with support and identity characteristics, where a lot of research focuses on the impact of one or maybe two identity factors, such as only looking at how being a first-generation college student affects your major, or only looking about how being a student with a disability affects your major declaration as well. And so there's a little bit of a lack of nuance around what each person brings in with them. Similarly, singular identity characteristics are also studied in this manner, where only looking at being an ethnic minority and how that relates to your major declaration, things of that nature. So what I'm hoping I've accomplished through this process and what I will continue to work on is developing a comprehensive and person-centered understanding and approach to understanding major declaration confidence. That being said, as you saw from the title of my talk, I looked at a lot of things, and so this will be hopefully an easier way to break it down. Where I looked at internal growth factors, and in specific, I examined meaning, purpose, and optimism. I also wanted to understand the impact of external connections, and so you'll see as I get into my methods, I examined it across on and off-campus sources of support. And third, I wanted to also understand the impact of personal identities, and I looked across a slew of identities as well, about how they all come back to major declaration confidence. So with that being said, let's talk about what that actually means for the purpose of this study. So through the literature I looked through, there were a lot of important criteria that emerges in terms of what's important for students in declaring their majors, where there's their personal interests, potential future earnings as they continue down this career path, social pressures that come from their families or communities, and many more factors. It's also important to note that declaring a major can be a major source of anxiety for a lot of students, and so it's important to understand what all goes into it. But specifically, I wanted to create a way of understanding major declaration confidence that works with Augustana's context of not being able to declare a major until the beginning of your second semester of your first year on campus. That being said, the definition I'll be using for major declaration confidence today is a student's combined feelings of confidence, motivation, positive attitude, and presence of concern toward their choice of academic major. To move into the several internal factors that I examined, I first began with meaning, which essentially is a way of talking about how people have personal value that they assign towards things. And it's often intertwined with purpose, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. But it's also seen as acting as a buffer against negative mental health. And so purpose, as I said, intertwines pretty heavily with meaning, but it's seen as the mechanism by which you're propelled towards meaningful goals. So meaning is the value in something, purpose is what gives you the drive to get there. And lastly, I wanted to understand optimism, which is generally defined as positive outlook on life and the belief that good things are coming my way, good things will happen to me. And all three of these are related pretty well with each other, but also with positive outcomes in college students and in general. In terms of external connections, this specific article from Hu et al., or Hu and colleagues, came out in 2020, got me really interested in understanding just a wide combination of different sources of support, in which classmates and roommates were found to influence student attitudes towards their majors, where students that had roommates that were in the same major were less likely to change their major, and when students were changing their majors, their peers had an influence as to what they changed to. And so I wanted to understand, what does this look like across an entire campus, and specifically our campus? That being said, I developed a measure in which I looked at every external source's level of positive or negative impact on a student's major declaration competence. I used a similar approach to look at personal identities, and so as you can see here, remember how I talked about how a lot of articles focus on one or maybe two identity categories at once? These are just a couple of good points of this, where rural first-generation college students tend to choose more career-focused majors than urban first-gen college students. Students of color feel more holistically supported by campus staff of color, which can lead to feelings of academic isolation. And lastly, male and female science students differ in self-efficacy, which impact their perception of their place within their field and major. So I wanted to understand, what about all of the identities that students carry with them? And so let's look at how they feel positively or negatively impacted by these identities in relation to their major declaration competence. That being said, to zoom out a little bit, these are the three hypotheses that I was interested in testing. Higher internal factors will predict a higher level of major declaration competence, which I'll start to refer to as MDC to save my voice and our time. Higher levels of positive impact from external connections will predict a higher MDC. And third, higher levels of positive impact from personal identities will predict a higher level of MDC as well. Essentially, if you want the shortened version, as students feel more assured and well supported across these three domains, I expected them to feel more confident in learning. So to actually do this, if you're a first-year student, or if you keep your eyes on the bulletin boards around campus, you probably saw this pretty much everywhere. I did a pretty good job of getting them in almost every building, but I incentivized first-year students to either get SONA credit, so thank you, Dr. Vincent and Dr. Barringer for that, or they could win one of 50 electronic Visa gift cards, so shout-outs to the Student Research Committee for making that possible. But I was able to incentivize 181 total first-year students to take my very significantly and substantially long survey. And in that, 137 were included for the final analysis sample. And these were domestic students that have declared or had strong intentions to declare a major later that semester, but not at the time of taking the survey. That being said, these were some of the predominant demographics that emerged, in which the majority of the sample were women, they were white, they came from middle-class socioeconomic status backgrounds, they did not identify as having a disability, the majority of them were continuing generation students, and the overwhelming majority lived here on campus, and most of them came from suburban backgrounds. So in terms of actually capturing major declaration competence, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to keep it specific to the context of Augustana, and so I combined 3 scales to make this possible with the timing of being able to declare only after the beginning of the second semester. And so I combined 3 scales, which I'll talk about later on, but across the 18 items, I was found to have a strong reliability between all of these items, which is a real nice pat on the back. But across the board, we saw that out of a total possible score of 90, participants scored an average of 70 points, which indicates that they are more confident than not in declaring their majors. And so here's a couple of example questions that made it onto the scale, such as, my major will open the door to many opportunities. How comfortable are you with the way you're making this decision? And I feel good about the major I've selected. And it's important to note that in combining 3 surveys that tend to use different language, I standardized all answers to be on a Likert scale of 1 through 5, and I kept the original survey anchor language. So nothing was too changed other than the scoring so that everything could make sense for my statistics. So let's actually look at the rest of the factors and understand how they actually predicted major declaration competence. So to measure internal factors as meaning, purpose, and optimism, I used well-established and well-used scales of the Meaning in Life questionnaire, which has questions such as, I'm always searching for something that makes my life feel significant. I used the Life Engagement Test to measure purpose, which asks questions such as, I don't care very much about the things I do. And the Revised Life Orientation Test to examine optimism, which asks questions such as, overall I expect more good things to happen to me than bad. And all of these were scored from 5-point Likert scales as well. With external connections, this is where I got a little bit more creative and decided to make my own source to see what I could pull off. So I looked across 33 total sources where there was a collapsed off-campus support category because the focus of understanding support was on campus. And so across several domains, there were 31 unique sources, which many of them are listed here on the side, where students had the option to rate themselves from anywhere from -2, so a significant negative impact on my major declaration competence, to +2, or a significant positive impact on my major declaration competence. Importantly, there was also the option to indicate that there was no impact, or that that specific connection source was not applicable to their major declaration competence. Moving forward into identities, I used a similar scoring structure from the -2 to +2, 0 in the middle, because it allowed for students that don't necessarily fit into certain boxes to say, hey, this doesn't actually apply to me. But it also allows for them to talk about significant positive and significant negative impact. So I examined across 9 total identities of biological sex, gender identity, nationality, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability, residential status, and first-generation college student status. So let's actually talk about what I found. So with internal factors, we saw that meaning correlated with major declaration competence, and it also predicted it as well, which is super exciting. In terms of purpose, there was a significant positive correlation, but there wasn't any prediction happening. With optimism actually did not correlate nor predict major declaration competence. So I'll talk more about it as we move into a discussion portion of the presentation, but across the board, we saw that meaning alone significantly predicts major declaration competence. In terms of looking at external support, I'll zoom out a little bit because I know this can be a little confusing. So I conducted what's called a factor analysis. And essentially that takes all 33 of these sources and says, hey, what sticks together? If people are getting positive support from one source, are they also getting it from another likely source? And so there emerges 3 factors, well there emerges many more factors, but there emerges 3 that are actually worth examining because they hold together really well with one another. The first one being what I've titled diverse student resources, and so this includes places such as OSIT or OISSS or multicultural support offices, students' PACE mentor, their TRIO mentor, student organizations, student culture groups, places like the OSL and the NLTV, things of that nature. So students are receiving positive support from these places, and it's essentially co-occurring sources of support, where if they're here, they're also likely at this other place or getting help from this other person. The second factor that emerged is what I've titled music-adjacent sources, where some of these strongest items were musical ensemble director, their bandmates, their private lessons instructors, and then a couple of other items that allow for potential music participation, such as campus ministries, cast members, which indicates the possibility of music theater, and Greek life, as there are certain organizations that are tailored towards musician students. Lastly, although it was not significant because it was below an alpha level of 0.7, it's still worth talking about in this presentation, where the third group is what I've titled peer athletic involvement, which had about an equal balance between classmates, peer mentors, but also their coach and their teammates. And so, if you can make it out over here, we saw that these factors did not significantly correlate with major declaration competence, nor did they actually predict it, which is interesting as well, and I'll talk more about that soon. But as a reminder, these are shared sources of support, and that these factors are what spit out of the statistical analysis, but it's up to me to interpret them, and so there's always more interpretive work to be done to make sure that these are the most accurate titles for these factors. In terms of looking at identities, we saw across the board that the majority of students rated themselves as having no impact, or the identity was not applicable to their major declaration competence. But what's interesting to note is that socioeconomic status was the only identity that had more than 50% of students rating either positive or negative impact. So we were curious to see, does this actually make a difference in major declaration competence, which we found out it did not through simple regression, where it was also not a significant predictor. And so to avoid a floor effect, we didn't conduct simple regressions on the remaining identity categories, as they would not come much farther from that. That being said, identities didn't really seem to make a difference in terms of major declaration competence. So I'd like to return to each hypothesis and kind of guide us through a little bit more of that. So in terms of higher internal factors predicting a higher level of MDC, we saw that meaning significantly correlated and predicted major declaration competence. And the way I interpret this is having a stronger sense of what someone finds valuable lends itself to feeling more confident, especially if that major is congruent with what their values are. So to give a personal example, I'm really interested in connecting with people and making a difference interpersonally. And so declaring a psychology major is pretty congruent with that value. And so I believe that's why those run pretty well together. Purpose significantly correlated, but it did not predict major declaration competence. And in a similar sense as meaning, where feeling a stronger sense of propulsion towards a goal lends itself to feeling more confident in that goal. But it's also important to remember that these are first-year students in their second semester, so while they might be declaring a major, they haven't had a ton of time to actually dig into it yet, where they might not be able to take certain classes, or they might not be able to have internship experiences that really show them, is this the right place to be? Is this what's actually helping me get to where I want to be and who I want to be? Lastly, optimism did not correlate or predict major declaration confidence, and one of the ways I interpreted this is that optimism actually isn't really required to feel confident in things, where people that are just dispositionally pessimistic, just they don't believe good things are coming their way, they can still feel confident about things. And so I'm still working on understanding this finding, but this is kind of where my head's at with it for now. But also, as we talk about, they're in their second semester of their first year, that feeling of optimism might still be growing because they're still getting adjusted to a new campus, and they've just recently declared a major, and so they're getting adjusted to that new identity as well. But the second hypothesis of external connections, higher positive impact from these external connections predicting higher MBC. We saw that these groups of diverse student resources, music-adjacent sources, and peer athletic involvement all emerged, which demonstrated co-occurring peer support, co-occurring peer and place support. And while it did not correlate or predict confidence in their major declaration, it still shows us who they're receiving support from and that it's positive and really helpful for them. And so as another reminder, these are subjective interpretations of these findings. And so I'm curious to hear what you all think about the naming of them as well. Lastly, with identities, if we remember, we saw that identities were seen to have a very low or no impact at all, and especially with socioeconomic status, the identity that actually received the most ratings, either positively or negatively, it still didn't predict major declaration confidence, which indicates that students don't really feel the same way about their identities impacting major declaration confidence as they might in other constructs. So I've included some research on identities and sense of belonging in college campuses, in which these are more salient constructs that might be a little bit more relevant to identity exploration. That being said, come back to meaning, because this was the only thing that stuck out of all of the factors. And so I'd ask you all to remember back to those two questions I asked you at the beginning of what do you find meaningful and how might meaning benefit students? So the way I interpreted this result, I wanted to especially highlight the timing of this study, in which students, as I said before, they have the value of something to them, where, oh, I'm going to declare this major in psychology because I want to connect with people, I want to make a difference, but I haven't taken stats yet, so I don't know if this is the right direction for me. So they haven't had the chance to necessarily be propelled in the direction, but they feel as though it's valuable. And so in a way, meaning is able to predate this major declaration confidence because they're likely coming into college, at least in many students' experiences, they're coming into college with a general sense of what they want to major in because they find it personally valuable or they had a good experience in high school. And then as I got into briefly there can be a sense of value in something without that propulsion yet, because they might think to themselves, hey, I find this really meaningful, I just don't know what to do with it yet. And so having more time in their classes, having more time at Augustana in general will help them develop that sense of purpose. And lastly, meaning is something that is deeply personal, and so students that have a higher sense of meaning in life, this can lend itself, as I said way earlier, to feeling more assured in the decisions that they're making. So that being said, as many of us are campus faculty, staff, and students as well, I want to talk about what this actually means for Augustana. So in terms of fostering a sense of meaning, we saw that this was the one thing that stuck out. And so encouraging students to engage in reflection about what this actually means to them, which is what I had all of them do from the beginning, and being able to talk about, hey, I feel this way, but I don't know what to do with it yet. Having these conversations, whether they're at core or with their academic advisors, is going to make a difference. Continuing to check in and sustain that fire as well. But with the other internal factors of purpose and optimism, it's possible that those will kind of emerge as they continue forward, assuming that that path is still what's valuable to them. We're talking more about purpose as they enter their sophomore year, which is where they're, this bit of a context where they're taking their religion class or they're participating in the Alive vocation program. And so there's more opportunities to participate in these discussions, but also making more opportunities is what's going to matter as well. In terms of support across campus, we saw that Augustana offers a substantial amount, I'm sure all of you have no doubt about that, of different places and people that are supportive. So it's important to support the places that we have and to make sure that we're taking good care of them, but it's also equally as important to support new organizations. And so with student organizations, I find that particularly salient because students feel as though there's not yet a place for me on campus, so I'm going to create it. And so making sure that we take care of student clubs like that, I feel as though that would be very beneficial to the institution as a whole. And lastly, with identities, it wasn't particularly salient to look at identities with major net motion confidence. So conducting more research on other constructs such as sense of belonging or resilience with a comprehensive approach such as the one I proposed here could be quite beneficial to see what Augustana is doing well in and what we could be doing better. All that being said, I know this was a lot to throw at you, so I'm really grateful for all your time. And if you didn't catch it in the beginning and you wanted to, here's the slideshow. But if you want to look through all my sources and if you'd like to see certain tables where I have all the numbers of how all of the sources of support step together, I have that down here. Thank you all for listening. I believe my committee is the first in line to ask me questions. It's a little scary.
I'll ask the first one.
I know that you elected not to include international students in the analyses, so I was curious about if you would have similar predictions related to the internal factors, external connections, and identities for international students that you did for domestic students.
Sure. Okay. So to use my own subjective understanding of what it's like to be an international student, which is very limited as I am a domestic suburban kid, I believe as though in discussions I've had with international students, I think having a sense of purpose would probably emerge because a lot of students that are attending, especially on, I believe the right term is F1 student visas, where if they don't do well, they're not able to continue. And so having a sense of purpose and really feeling propelled towards that goal of achieving whatever major they're interested in declaring and pursuing as well, but making sure that I think that would also connect back to the external support of off-campus, especially those family sources. And so my family wants me to do this, my community's at home need me to succeed, I have to really pull this off. That's, I guess, how I would start to answer that question.
Okay, I'll ask one here. We can talk about like methods and details another time, but what I was really curious was, you can think about classes that you think did a particularly good job of incorporating that sense of meaning that you were talking about, like not just what are you trying to learn from the course, but why does it matter? What did those classes do particularly well? No fair saying Psych 300 because that's
Yeah, well,
the whole
that's
point of it. Maybe, maybe some other classes that did just a good job.
Sure. So I'll say I'm a bit biased because both of the professors that taught them are in the room. But nevertheless, classes that engage in a lot of student reflection, I feel as those, for me personally, that's helped me get a stronger sense of what the class content actually means to me, but what it means for me going forward. And I'm grateful enough that the classes were in psychology. So it does have a personal value for me moving into applying to graduate school in psych. But I think across the board, classes that really make you stop and think, and especially, because I know this is an interest of yours, but also as a student, I feel it, having limited technology in the classroom and really being able to engage in discussions like that without, playing webkins on your computer or things of that nature, playing the New York Times crossword and everything like that. Being able to use the classroom as a space for meaningful discussion and not just a place where you're checking off days on your syllabus until you graduate in some cases. I think that's a really unique and powerful spot for that.
I really enjoyed watching this project unfold, and I'm glad you came by with stats questions a few times. That's a lot of fun. But I found myself thinking about some of our conversations about stats and stuff like that. So I'm going to ask kind of a boring stats question for most people, and it's actually based on slide 22, where you said that something So you look at socioeconomic status, which you described as being, people being below average or above average. And then you say there's no correlation there. And I'm just wondering, if you're doing basic linear correlations, you might miss something if it's curvilinear in nature, so that you get something out of it at the low end and the high end of the spectrum for SES. How about looking at that, like a curvilinear correlation?
So that's something I just know a little bit less about, but in terms of our approach to picking out SES from the bunch and using it as a predictor, one, because everything else just kind of fell flat on its face in terms of having any kind of impact. And two, this was a pretty exploratory measure. This was something I hadn't come across in the literature, and so this is kind of like my first attempt at pulling it off. And three is because I probably didn't know that I could use that sort of test to answer this question. So I'd actually, if we have time before I actually graduate, I'd love to actually try to do that.
Sam, let me see if I understood things correctly. I think the SES variable that you used was whether or not SES had a positive, negative, or neutral impact. It wasn't actually what the SES was, but it was how it impacted. So yeah, and that's kind of interesting too, because somebody's, you can imagine somebody with a low socioeconomic status saying that this is like, it actually is more meaningful to me because I've gone through some hard things in life.
I think that's where the future of this research could go, is incorporating mixed methods, where we can understand what actually goes into these identity categories, or working in semi-structured or maybe even focus group interviews, specifically talking about identities or sources of support across campus. I think that's where stuff like that could really come out of the numbers and into interpretation. We'd love to do that too.
Questions for Sam? Does it just have to come from his committee?
I'm gonna go off of Austin's question when he asked your, or Dr. Williamson's question. About the idea, because this is all like before I declare my major, like how do I find that meaning? Like obviously it's important throughout your whole time, because then that turns into career paths or, you know, the next steps. But when I think about like the classes you were describing, like beautiful to have a class where I let them reflect. In my reality, that does not happen until the upper level courses. And that's me thinking about the classes that I teach at the lower level, right?
Yep.
And so I wonder where you think in that first semester, is it happening inside a classroom? Are there places that it should happen in, or could even happen in the classroom? Because I've been taught intro to psych in a very long time, but I can't necessarily imagine where that's happening. I mean, it could, I'm not saying it can't. But what other things at Augustana in general, like, do you think the idea of finding meaning, or actually like saying what is meaningful to me, do you see that having a home in that first semester based on your depth that you've seen that first year experience in the last 3 years? So if it's not in a classroom, where else do you think that they could start to ask that question, since it's so driving their major?
Right. Well, I think I'll be a little bit biased in answering the first part of this, is through the peer group, right? Where they're put in a large setting, where they're in the gym and there's 900 other students there. But this group around them, those are the people that they're gonna at least take one class with for the entirety of the semester. And I know there's a lot of changes coming up with the peer mentor, Viking mentor program. And so I'd be curious maybe making some more connections there to make some more meaningful discussions about meaning happen. Because I think peer sources, especially when you're in your first semester of college, because that's who you're really out to connect with. At least that's who I was out to connect with when I first got here. I wasn't necessarily ready to go talk to professors as soon as I landed at Augustana. But definitely spurring on more conversations about meaning between students, especially students of similar ages, where having, a senior peer mentor lead them in discussion about meaning, that might look like, hey, you've had more time to figure this out, where I necessarily haven't. And so that's a question that maybe Nicole especially might be able to help you answer in terms of where we're headed with peer mentoring, to see how we can better incorporate that. Because it's definitely tough to do that in a lot of those intro classes, especially when you have to get through so much content. And so I think one of the ways that could be done is just through the different types of assignments. Because I'll say in my intro class, I had the privilege of taking intro with Dr. Abby Kleinsmith, who's not here anymore, she went back to New York. But one of the the assignments we had was what was called a connection paper, where we would take a concept we learned in class, we'd actually apply it to real life. And I still remember both papers that I wrote because I just found them so interesting, because I was taking what I copied down from the lecture, and I'd actually think about it, and then turn it into a whole paper reflecting on it. So I think it's a tough balance with some of the classes. Like I can see that being more difficult in a class like research methods, where it's kind of hard to see like, what's the meaning in quasi-experimental design or something like that. I don't think it's impossible. I hope that answered your question. Happy to take up questions.
Not to be the question asker, but I think you did a wonderful job of including all of these internal and external factors that can influence decision confidence. One of the things that is not accounted for in this project, which is perfectly fine because we can't do it all, is what I think could be related to optimism, and that's just the state of the world. Like after you graduate, which picking a major is related hopefully to a future job, or at least one of your majors. And so we have these messages that the job market is, I was going to say trash, but trash. And or that education is devalued. I mean, so these are messages that we're receiving, like you don't need to go to college, you don't need to do this, and then also job opportunities might be limited in some spheres. So thinking about optimism, I'm wondering if you could see a connection between why optimism might not have been associated with your outcome here, but maybe that's because of not just these internal factors, but chaos.
Yeah, I think one of the first places I go to after hearing you say that is feeling, you can feel optimistic, but when you look out at the world and there's so much happening, it's like, well, I don't know. And then that comes back to kick your confidence a little bit. So I'd be really curious to understand how you can measure that too. So maybe another exploratory thesis like this.
And again, I'm not expecting you to have had that here too. I mean, this is another layer, but yeah.
So Joey first.
So I kind of have two questions. The first one is, where would clubs that are related to specific majors fall into this? Because I don't think I really saw that on your slides. And my second question kind of ties into that, being, how do you think it would be best to apply this to clubs like that? Because I'm going to be the compliance officer for Psych Club and Sci Kayak next year. I want to make sure that I'm doing my best to apply these concepts.
Can you remind me of the first question you asked? I just want to make sure I'm getting it.
Like, where would those clubs that are related to specific majors fall in this study?
Well, that's a good point, because I did have to collapse across a lot of these. And the reason I did collapse across, here I'll go back to the slide, across a lot of different connection opportunities is because if I fully fleshed out the list, nobody would finish the survey. And so this was at least the first start. And so I think what we could do moving forward is focus on student clubs. I'm also biased in that because I've been leading the Psych Club for so long. But being able to understand, hey, interest clubs versus academic clubs, I think there's absolutely something there. And actually, there were a couple of students, because I also offered the other on-campus support, and some students used that as a way to talk about a support that already happened, but that they just wanted to write about it a little bit. And some people talked about those specific clubs as having an impact because they were able to get exposure, and it was coming from students their age versus a professor who went to college many, many years ago prior. So I think there's totally something there. And I think future versions of this could totally address it. And in terms of what clubs can do now, I think it comes back to kind of the goal of your club, because if you're an interest club versus an academic club, or yeah, I guess general interest versus academic interest club, I think there's a little bit of a difference in terms of, I guess, what might be expected, but that also comes down to how you run the club too. I think that having discussions about meaning can be really effective, and I'll just say with Psych Club in particular, we host a lot of guest speakers that have different career paths and different places and ways they took to say that definitely helps me feel a little bit more assured in where I'm headed, and so that gives me a little bit more of a sense of purpose. So I can see that definitely emerging. And I think in general, one, the structure of the club, because some clubs are very much like you show up, you sit and listen, and you leave. Others are more discussion-based, where you actually do a lot more hanging out with each other. Some are hands-on activities, it all just depends. But I think that meeting in particular, I think, is definitely visible in all of these, because that's why you're going to the club, is because you find something valuable in there. So being able to actually focus on it and talk, I think is something that, one, I'd like to do later tonight at Psych Club at our last meeting. But can also just be really beneficial in general, especially because, at least with Psych Club, and I'll shut up about Psych Club in a minute, but I know I need to talk a lot about it. The majority of our students that show up are first years and sophomores. Because one, the juniors get busier, they get a little bit bored, that's not my place. But the first years are coming because they want to see what else is out there. And so being able to combine both, hey, here's a path, but also here's what you might find interesting and meaningful about it. I think that comes down to who you're inviting to speak, and maybe giving yourself a chance to talk with the person before they come to speak. I know that's something I always wish I could have done. I think that's a definite step you can take, and I'll stop answering the question at risk of running in circles now. Dr. Schultz, I think you have a question.
Yeah. Well, at risk of being really cheesy, I have to say it's really meaningful to watch you do your thing and just share your project with us. My question is, as you talked about some ideas of implications for Augustana with these results, I'm curious if you had a chance to talk, as you think about that orientation of a group of folks who are particularly invested in their majors, the majors of their loved ones might be parents or parental figures or caregivers, who I think about lots of conversations that I've had with first-year students and sophomores of like feeling a lot of pressure from folks to, in their lives, really well-meaning, but what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? And to make those decisions. What message would you give to the parental figures, the caregivers, as you think about implications of these results?
Sure. So I think with meaning, I'll always come back to the fact that it's personal value. And I mean, just the nature of psychology, but also with meaning, there's individual differences in everything. Where I might find looking out at mountains and scenery beautiful, where someone might find, hey, jogging next to this busy street in Chicago, that's really where it's at for me. So being able to tell parents that, you know, especially, I guess my mind jumps to parents that are like, you have to go be a doctor, you have to be a lawyer, and that's it, because you gotta make money for yourself. Being able to tell them that, you know, the general college advice of just because it's something that you'd like for your child, it doesn't mean it's something they want for themselves. But also trusting in the fact that they'll figure it out one way or another, as long as they have you know, support from the family, but also from the institution as part of their exploration process. I guess that's what I would start to say. Other question?
So, what's my question? So, as a career coach, like one of the questions that I ask students every meeting is, what is a pressing question that you have about making a good life for yourself, right? So like, technically our office can help you get a job, but what I really want, right, to ask about is, why do you want to get that job, right? And what that answers. And so I wonder, the place of major declaration probably sits a little bit more in my colleagues' wheelhouse with the exploring majors, but we do, for the time being, work as first-year advisors too. And so I'm just incredibly biased because I'm a cheerful pessimist, so I love that optimism is not indicative of that, but the question of meaning looms large in my life. I'm very biased in the way I sort of create coursework and ask for reflection. But as a peer mentor, and particularly thinking about the students who maybe wouldn't have answered this survey, right? Who didn't know what they were gonna do, what do you think could be based on this little chunk, right, of the world that you've been able to survey. What do you think, like, Claire, in the fall, why not ask your students this? Why not ask your advisees to reflect on this? Why not, right, like, just like from this little chunk?
Well, I think maybe, I guess where I went with the first part of that question was the role of peer mentors, but also I take that more in the role of peers as well as they're transitioning in college, because a lot of the athletic students that might not always show up to every welcome week meeting, they're out with their teammates as well. And I think one of the ways that you can start to talk about meaning in those contexts is just to borrow a word from counseling psychology, is self-disclosure, where I guess if I were to start that conversation, I would talk about how I was scared to come to college, but I still wanted to, because at the end of the day, this is what I want to do, and this is what I find meaningful. Because I think it can be really tough, one, for first year students to open up when they've just been dumped at Augustana and you're in a hot gym. So, you know, maybe day one, not the best time for that. But being able to see people older than me have been through some really interesting stuff with what they think they want to do. And it's not, you know, because peer mentors tend to carry the reputation of these are our best students. That's why they're leading you guys through this week. Where, you know, these are the students that have been in core because they've changed their major 6 times. These are the students that have dropped a class because they didn't know what they were doing. And so being able to be honest about that with your mentees, but also just with your first year students across any context, I think that's going to spur on a lot of those conversations. In terms of the more academic context that you were talking about, where I guess your role in that, if I may.
Yeah, and the academic is probably more advising, right? Like
Yeah.
The FYI 100.
Honestly, I think some very careful self-disclosure might be pretty beneficial too. Because I know that I've definitely benefited from talking with other professors in the psych department about how I didn't actually get into grad school this time.
Yeah.
They're like, oh yeah, I didn't either. And it was like totally fine. I turned out okay. And so
Oh, thank goodness.
because there can be so many expectations, especially when you come to Augustana where everybody's doing everything. I mean, this is really good proof of that. There can be so much pressure to get it right the first time, or that's it. And so being able to hear from both your peers, but also important faculty and staff, I think that makes a huge difference. And it definitely, at least in my own experience, it's really helped me feel confident in where I'm heading next, and to know that I don't have to have it all figured out, but I'm going to figure it out regardless. I'm going to try. I think that's where that can start to happen.
Thank you for your perspective.
Thanks for asking. Any other questions?
All right, brings us